Okay, in this video I'm going to talk about money. Now normally in your book that sort of puts off talking about money until chapter 10, but I thought it would be better to move it up a little bit because talking about money is going to make talking about other things a lot easier. And as you hopefully learned when you read it in your book, money basically has three uses. Money is a medium of exchange, it's a store of value, and it's a unit of account. Now, money is one of those things that is one of the reasons why I love economics, because nobody actually had to come in and tell people that money was a really good idea. Governments didn't have to start this practice out. It's what's called an emergent phenomenon. In other words, if you just let people on their own, they will actually think of this idea and just start doing it without any kind of person controlling it. It'll just begin to happen. People will choose something that everybody wants, like grain or salt, and they'll just start using it as a commonly accepted currency. It doesn't take long for people to realize that bartering goods, okay, just trading them back and forth for each other, is annoying and hard because nobody knows how much anything is worth compared to other things, or at least it's hard to figure out, hundreds of goods and services and their value relationship with each other at any given time. So it didn't take long for people to realize that it would be good to have some one standard. So historically, people have used things like salt, that's where we get the word salary, or sheep, which is where we get the English word for poverty, impecunious, from the Latin word pecus, meaning sheep, and things like grain, gold, or silver, things that were relatively easy to carry around and that everybody might want at some time or other. Now, this kind of money that actually has use value and can be used on its own for something other than money is actually called commodity money, and that's really the first step in the evolution of money toward what we have now. And that as things went along, money began to change, especially in response to social or technological changes. So the first big change that I want to talk about is that around the 7th century, the Phoenicians, who also developed the alphabet, in part because they traded widely throughout the Mediterranean world, actually began striking gold and silver coinage and coins of other metals. And this is still commodity money, right? Gold and silver still have sort of use value on their own, or are valuable in and of themselves. And it would take a long time for this sort of coinage to change. And the next big change happened during the Song dynasty in China, where they began moving toward paper money. Now, China could do this because, and this was around the 10th century AD, because they had just developed movable type a couple hundred years before Gutenberg's printing press, and because the government was there was so much central authority that the government was able to make paper money, which relied so much on trust and the promise to pay actual goods in exchange for them, they could make that stick. It would be another 7 centuries before anyone in Europe would really have meaningful paper money, and this happened in Sweden partly because Sweden was very rich in copper. A lot of wealth was in copper, but it's really difficult to carry large quantities of copper around. So instead of doing that, they had this paper money that could be redeemed for copper, and this was sort of their first paper money. Now this, and what China did, because their notes were actually issued with a promise to repay in salt, is called representative money, because its value comes from the fact that it can be exchanged for something that has use value. So it's no longer commodity money. It's no longer valuable in and of itself, like the gold and silver coins. Instead, it has value based on the possibility of being exchanged. It would be a while before there was a development away from representative money, but it did happen. And the last major development in the history of money that we're going to talk about is that many countries, including the United States, used to be on the gold standard. Right? We're not anymore. A lot of people think that we still are, but it used to be that you could exchange $20 for an ounce of gold or something like that. And in 1971, the United States actually went off of that system. So the money that we use now is actually only valuable basically because we think it's valuable, but ultimately because the government has declared it a valid form of payment for goods and for the repayment of debts. And so this is what's called fiat money. So hopefully you're noticing that the development of money involved a lot of transitions from more trustworthy sorts of money to money that required us to have more trust in major institutions. Commodity money required some degree of trust, especially stamped coins, because you had to trust that the government wasn't sort of watering it down, right? That they weren't debasing the coin so that it was less gold and more tin or something like that. And that's why you find so much emphasis in places like the Old Testament and other ancient sources on fair weights and scales. And then later on, the move to paper money required even more trust, in that you had to believe that those notes were able to be exchanged for something like salt or copper or gold or silver, as under the gold standard. And if you began to believe that maybe the issuer of the note, like a goldsmith or a silversmith or the government or a bank, didn't have the money to repay it, or didn't have the gold and silver or the salt to repay their notes, then you might freak out, and the value of the notes would go way, way down, and it would ruin the economy. And then with fiat money, that problem is potentially even worse, because the money technically can be exchanged for any good reliably, so it relies even more on trust now. So understanding money and developments in money is crucial to understanding the forces that have shaped the world as it is today, and that are going to continue to shape the world and your everyday lives. When Phoenicia began minting coins, it came right on the eve of the flowering of Mediterranean civilization, like the Greek civilizations and the Roman Empire. When Florence developed bonds, which we'll talk about later, it came right on the eve of the Renaissance. Better and better forms of money allow more and more resources to be traded or brought to bear for economic development. So these kinds of advances allow for more and more material progress. So to recap, money has three basic uses. It can be used to exchange goods and services rather than bartering directly. It can be used to measure the value of goods and services rather than having to come up with some value in terms of lots of other goods and services. And it can be stored, which we'll talk about later, because this ability to store money allows banks to come into existence and allows money to be lent. And we have three different kinds of money historically. The first is commodity money, that is money that actually has value in and of itself, like gold and silver coinage or salt or grain. And then representative money, which is certificates, especially paper certificates that can be redeemed in exchange for gold or silver or something else that has value in and of itself. And then we have fiat money, which is money that governments say is valuable, but there's nothing that really backs it up like gold or silver.